Well, hello again. As I mentioned to you yesterday, I'll be back. And I'll be back to talk about habits. Okay? Why are habits so important? Well, actually, they are the foundation of what we call behavior. Okay? Acquired behavior. Acquired, learned behavior. Habits are a function of learning. And the way we learn to develop specific behavioral patterns has a lot to do with what I'm interested in as a learning theorist, my colleagues in the experimental laboratories over there, my rat runners are really interested in the laws and principles by which you actually acquire behavior that actually occurs over a period of time and maintains, not uncommonly, throughout your entire lifetime. Okay? How does that happen? Well, we're going to talk about that today and tomorrow. Okay? The scientific investigation of learning and how we learn really dates back more than a century, about 120 years ago. And much of the great stuff that has gone on in this field has occurred right here in the experimental laboratories of our American universities. That's right, American universities. The wonderful stuff that has gone on over the decades to understand how we acquire behavior, how we maintain it, and often how it can extinguish or disappear out of the behavioral repertoire. Or why it won't go away, okay? It won't extinguish. I've learned something here, and damn it, it just keeps coming back. I want to change my behavior. But those old habits just don't die. Okay? How come? Well, we're going to try to answer some of those questions today and tomorrow. Okay. Experimental psychologists have always been interested in this question. And what you're reading in the public media these days is an increasing interest in habits, the neuroscience of habits. What are the underlying biological and physiological and cortical mechanisms and subcortical mechanisms that actually support the acquisition of learned behavior? For those of you who would like to learn a little bit more about what is going on in a very accessible magazine, you might want to turn to Scientific American, and this is June 2014. This subject has become so important, it's hit the front page of one of our most popular scientific magazines on the bookshelf, on the magazine shelf. Some of you already purchased this and perhaps even read the article, okay? But it is really very interesting as we're beginning to understand increasingly clearly what are the biological and physiological substrata that supports the end product of our behavior and produces a behavioral pattern that is consistent, coherent, and often linear. Okay? It allows me to get from here to there. And in other words, it reduces chaotic random behavior and channels it in a particular direction, like an arrow-like direction, and those are habits. Now, there are all kinds of uh, investigations currently underway, understanding the neuroscience, the underlying uh, biological and physiological support systems for learned behavior. And one of the most impressive investigators in this field is a colleague, uh, a fellow who have come to respect over the years, who has uh, completed or is continuing to work on a thorough understanding of the neuroscience of learned behavior. This investigator is an experimental psychologist, formerly at Scripps Institute, and now has moved into one of the federal agencies, the United States, overseeing drug addiction. Okay? His name is George F. Koob. Koob. The title of this article, which I received as one of his seminars, is entitled How the Brain Forms New Habits and Why Willpower is Not Enough. Underline that, folks. Willpower is not enough to break a habit, to change a habit. Willpower is not enough. So we have to go back and understand, if we're going to change behavior, willpower is not enough. If we're going to change a habit, we have to do it a very different way, okay? You don't have to go very far. Amazon, on the internet, bookstores, there is a plethora of books on how to change your habits, how to develop habits for the successful individual, how to break habits if you are overweight, for example. Here is another rather impressive work by Trafton, Gordon, and Misra. It's called Training Your Brain to Adopt Healthful Habits, Mastering the 5 Brain Challenges. Now, I only offer this to you as an example of what's out there. Pick up these self-help books. Okay? This one is, you have some reading ahead of you here, okay? But that's just one example. I could cite 20 more that are trying to help you change your behavior, okay? By the way, many of those people who have read through the literature end up in my office. These self-help books are really interesting to read. Many of them are insufficient to be able to produce much benefit to the reader. Okay, that's my concern. These self-help books sometimes are quite limited in the authors, even in their own understanding about the behavioral laws and principles of learning and the neuroscience behind learning in writing their books, okay? But they're trying to help. So what we're doing here is trying to clarify a little more in a very basic way, if you will please, okay, how a habit is formed, maintained, and extinguished. Okay. Take a look at this chart. And the x-axis here, if you want to call it that, this axis, let's label that habit strength. The strength of the habit. Remember, that is an index of its ability to resist extinction. Okay? The strength of it continues to be present in my behavioral repertoire. Ding, ding, ding. These are units. It can be any units from 1 to 100 in strength, whatever it is. Okay? But it's a measure of strength. This, on the other hand, is a measure of performance. And that is, if you're going to perform some kind of a behavior, notice I'm manipulating my hands, but I'm also talking about the behavior that occurs within your head, and that is thinking, the cortex. Remember, that is behavior. And what is changing here through these principles, actually, this changes as well following those principles. So cognitive activity obeys the same laws of learning as the manipulation of my fingers. They all follow the same basic principles of learning and how you develop habits. Ooh, gosh, interesting. So, to begin with, let's say I want to simply pick this up. Okay? That is a behavior that I want to learn. Okay? Now, I've never done that before. Okay? Let's just say I've never done it before. However, because it's rather enjoyable to produce the byproduct of this manipulation, if you will, I get to actually talk to you here, kind of enjoy that. I consider that to be a positive reinforcer, okay? It's positive for me, as someone who never shuts up, to really be able to talk to you with this in his hand, okay? So that's a positive reinforcer. And every time I pick one of those up, turn around and talk to you about it, believe it or not, that skill becomes stronger. Stronger. I just don't get a kick out of it. There is an actual habit that is being performed as a result of the positive reinforcement of that behavior. Boom, boom, and talking to you. Okay? This applies to every behavioral pattern in your repertoire. Not this, but anything. You are positively reinforced for that behavior if it is to persist as part of your overall behavioral repertoire. And if it is not positively reinforced and you simply perform this function without receiving that reinforcement, that behavior actually doesn't last very long in the behavioral repertoire. It actually drops out. Okay, off the radar scope. It's weak, and as a weak habit pattern, it becomes less and less available to you in your behavioral repertoire. Okay? It's got to be positively reinforced. And there are different ways to positively reinforce a behavior to produce a habit. But let's just say, for simplicity's sake here, that whatever I am doing, it's enjoyable. Okay? And I do it over and over again, and this is what happens. That behavior, I'm going to sketch this for you rather primitively, but anyway, that's what happens. Remember, this is the strength of the habit with continued reinforced practice.
You have to practice it and reinforce it. What you find happening here is something like this. That behavior, whatever it is, begins to look like this. It's not linear, but its strength increases. Okay? And the strength of it is a function of a lot of things. The potency of the reinforcer, how powerful that reinforcer is, and also the frequency with which that behavior is actually reinforced. Okay? Now, we're going to call this reinforced behavior. Okay? Reinforced. Now I've got some colors here. Let's try red, okay? Because I want to demonstrate something else that's happening here to behavior, okay? And that is a behavior that just occurs sort of randomly, but it's not only that, but it's a behavior that you'd like to acquire, perhaps, and it is not reinforced, okay? So what we have here in red is this. We have some behavior, whatever it is, appearing in your behavioral repertoire, okay, for a while, and then it actually drops off. It looks like it's being acquired, but in a very weak and feeble way. Okay, and then it begins to just weaken and fall right out of your behavioral pattern. Okay, yeah, that's what happens. Now, something else. This is behavior here that is reinforced every time it occurs, whatever that is. This, I pick it up, okay. And I will notice that behavior becomes really very part of my presentation, and it's a habit. So is that, okay? And we're going to call that 100% reinforcement. Every time it occurs, it's occurring at 100%. That is, every time it occurs, it's reinforced. Okay? Now, there are other kinds of behavioral patterns that emerge that really are not reinforced every time. Let's say in the beginning, we have a behavior that is reinforced, let's say, every time we see this occurring just like this, and then something happens here. It's not reinforced every time. It could be reinforced every other time. What I mean by reinforced, I mean some kind of a pleasurable experience results from it. So if there are situations where the behavior is actually performed, but there is no noticeable positive reinforcement for that behavior, something else happens, okay? You'll notice that the learning will be a little slower here, but the strength of that behavior continues a lot like 100% reinforcement. And we're going to call this, let's say, every other time, I really get a kick out of what I do. Other times it's kind of a pain in the neck or whatever it is, or it's neutral. It's neutral. So we're going to call this 50% reinforcement. There are other behavioral patterns that are a product of this. Let's what are we going to do? Let's use blue. Let's use blue to demonstrate what? A behavior, whatever that is, whatever that habit is that's being learned, starts out here at maybe 50% or 100% reinforcement. Then it drops off to 50%, and then it drops off to some variable amount. It's only being reinforced maybe once every 2 or 3 times. So we have what is 2 or 3 times, 4 to 10 times, 1 in 100 times later down the line. Variable reinforcement. Variable reinforcement. And that's that. And it kind of follows a similar learning curve. Maybe not as slow, not as fast as 100%, but nevertheless, you see that behavior strengthening when it is reinforced once every 3 times, once every 5 times, once every 7, once every 10 times, once every 3 times, wide-ranging reinforcement ratios. That's life. That is what happens. Our behavior is actually reinforced on a variable reinforcement schedule, whether you know it or not. That's what life is, variable reinforcement schedules. It's not consistent all the time. No, it's not. That's it. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do is to join me tomorrow as this learned behavior is acquired and strengthened. And if you'll tune in with me tomorrow, I'll tell you what happens to those behaviors under these different reinforcement schedules. Really interesting, and it explains a lot about why we cannot break habits. I will see you tomorrow.